very, very, very happy and thankful that we have Yair Shahar from Phase One. He's going to talk about the iXH platform and Phase One's new MkII 72 millimeter lens. To give a little bit of background on Yair, he was born in Israel in the late 60s. Grew up around fighter jets, mostly in the desert. He did some national service for his country for a number of years, studied economics as a start, then shifted to industrial design. Worked as a designer and modeler, owned a small studio specializing in composite materials for the high-tech aviation industries. From there, he joined Scitex in 2000 as an application engineer in the scanners and cameras division. And then this is right before Leaf became a separate group, and he was in charge of some of the design aspects of that product and the Leaf capture software. Yair moved to the UK in 2002 and stayed with Leaf throughout the Creo Kodak years until 2009, doing sales, marketing, support, and business development. When Phase One bought Leaf from Kodak, he became the product manager for Leaf and MkII America brands in America. And in 2015, the Cultural Heritage Division was formed at Phase One, and then he was reallocated for their R&D efforts in sales and marketing for Phase One. And so he's there to talk about this great iXH product. And Yair, I'm gonna give you the floor, as they say.
All right, thank you, Peter. Yeah, I mean, no further introduction needed, really. I would say maybe good afternoon to everyone. It's kind of evening time here. It's in London. Had a fairly rainy day, typically, but then we are looking to get some new COVID-19 restrictions coming in this weekend, so it's all going to be fun. But anyway, I'll dive straight in. Phase One, I mean, I guess most of you are familiar with at least the name and possibly the equipment as well. Looking at our, let's say, core business areas. Sorry, it's just jumping. Yeah, I'll do the slides. So looking at the core business areas, historically it was always professional photography, commercial photography, product, cars, architecture, fashion, you name it. That over time kind of evolved into adding let's say amateur photographies or landscape photography, what we would like to call the enthusiast amateurs or something like that. Industrial and aerial imaging is something that kind of always existed in one shape or form, but about 10 years ago we started taking it more seriously. And from being maybe a small entry thingy into the business, we've become, within 10 years, we've become the, let's say, de facto leader in, or the go-to product when it comes to aerial imaging. So most of the services that you are familiar with that give you mapping and things like that, chances are that many of the big names already use our equipment. Then when I say industrial is something that covers many areas. It can be anything from digitizing or imaging of LCD panels to some other electronic devices, but over time we see more and more requirement for high resolution cameras when it comes to inspection of anything from windmills to tunnels to railway systems and so on and so forth. Now, cultural heritage was always there or thereabouts. So there were always museums and libraries and archives who were interested in high resolution cameras and systems. But up until maybe 6 or 7 years ago, we didn't really looked at it as a specific area or a specific market. And then in 2013, which was the same year when we actually started working with digital transitions on the CH market in the US, we actually started taking it more seriously and sort of set up a team dedicated for cultural heritage. And that means a few people in research and development, a few people in sales, and of course, product management, which is something in between that makes the call when it comes to designing and defining new products and helping marketing and helping sales and so on. Now, our I would say resources were always obviously products. Then there's the technology behind them. So that's sensor technology, optics, coding, software, and so on. But the one thing that kind of puts everything together is obviously people. And when we say people, it's our people, engineers, production people, designers, electronics experts, optical experts, and so on. And we have people working in Denmark, we have people working in Israel, we have people working in Japan. This is all R&D and production. And then we have sales and marketing people all over the world. So we have people in the US, we have people in Japan, we have people across Europe, we have people in Asia as well with offices or working from home, all sorts of things. And yeah, so I think the company at the moment covers something like, I can't remember the number of countries, but in terms of people, there's around 200 of us worldwide, something like that. And if you know a little bit about the more recent history, then there is phase one and there is capture one. And while the products have many synergies between them and so on and so forth, Capture One is at the moment looked at as a separate, almost as a separate entity when it comes to the business part of it. Of course, there are some mutual projects that we are working together on. Move on. That brings us to the iXG and the the iXH, and the iXH is the latest and greatest. It's something that we launched in March this year, but it's not totally brand new, meaning that it's based on something. So if we look back at when we started with the cultural heritage, we started with something that was called an iXR, which was, let's say, a derivative of one of the aerial cameras that we stuck one of our IQ backs or one of the leaf backs on. It was very robust, very solid. It was mirrorless, no less moving parts, and so on. But it wasn't such an integrated product, and that brought us to the iXG, which was launched in 2017. I would say the first integrated camera system, specifically designed for reprographic applications, and that meant having the sensor unit and the focusing mechanism and the lens all working together with electronics inside, mechanics inside, and so on and so forth. So it's not something that you can take the back off and drop it on the floor or clean it separately or have it on another camera. These things, while they give you a lot of flexibility, they also give more rooms for error and let's say higher or actually lower tolerances when it comes to focusing accuracy and things like that. So with the iXH, we looked at all the great things in the iXG, and we knew that we want to put a higher resolution sensor. It's a newer generation of sensor. And we looked at the design features and also industrial design, but functionality, and so on and so forth. And that brought us to do a few interesting things. So starting with, of course, the sensor. So it's the latest Sony 151 megapixel sensor. It's the same sensor that we use in the IQ4150 as well as the IXM 150 in its different versions for aerial, for machine vision, and things like that. The sensor comes in three, let's say, flavors. So we have it as just a standard RGB sensor. We have it as an achromatic sensor, meaning with no RGB filters in front of the pixels. And then we have the wide spectrum version. Wide spectrum means there's no IR block filter in front of the sensor, and that lets some UV light come in and some near infrared light come in as well. Then the next thing is obviously with that sort of resolution, we're talking about pixels that are, I think, 3.76 microns, fairly small. We realized that optics need to be optimized for this. And we looked at the optics we had, and we still have for the iXG, namely the Schneider Kreuznach 72 millimeter and the 120 millimeter spheric lens. And we thought, okay, the key thing about having such a big and high resolution sensor is being able to capture large objects. And we always had that sort of aspiration to be the first ones to say, yes, we can do a 300 ppi, which was always something that people were using large format scanners for, or maybe using cameras or lower resolution scanners and doing some stitching. We wanted to say, no, we can do one shot, 300 ppi, giving you the best quality that will stand any kind of guidelines like Fuji, 4-star, 3-star, metamorphose light, you name it. It took a little bit of work, and as some of you might know, designing a lens is not a simple thing, but I'll explain a little bit about it. Other new things about the camera. So we're looking at 10G Ethernet. And again, because the camera is using the same sort of platform as the IQ4 and the IXM solutions, we can actually make use of Ethernet in 10G, and that increases speed. Maybe speed is not that a big thing when it comes to cultural heritage digitization, but when you think about the flexibility, for instance, working in a studio where you have multiple workstations and you just have a line of sockets in the wall for your Ethernet or networking. Imagine a situation, and that becomes maybe more relevant these days, where we end up doing a little bit more work remotely. Think about having a camera plugged into the wall and controlling it remotely through the internet, for instance. So that's one example. USB-C, and that basically takes everything that's good with USB 3 and making it a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit more powerful, allowing you to use slightly longer cables as well. Things like cooling. And we realized that with cultural heritage digitization, in many cases, you have a camera sitting on a copy stand, working day in, day out, normally with live view running as well, and that obviously generates a lot of heat. So we looked at what can we do to improve that. So from the outside or externally, we added some cooling fins, and that's basically just helps dissipate some of the heat. We added some quite innovative, we call them pads or special pads, sitting between the heat sink and the actual housing, and that again helps heat go away quicker. And the last thing that you probably note in this image is that there's no screen. And we definitely realized that with that kind of situation where the camera is on a copy stand, a screen is not really helping us. In some areas, it actually, because it's made of glass and there's many different layers and so on, it actually slows down the heat dissipation. So why not just remove the screen, give us more space, more metal work that can get rid of heat, and obviously save on the complexity and less bits and pieces inside the camera. The shutter is obviously in the lenses. So the shutter in the new lens is the same shutter we have in the Schneider-Kreuznach lenses, and it's the same shutter we use in our aerial cameras. That means that it can just go and go and go forever and ever. Imagine having the camera on an airplane and having to, let's say, stop a mission to get the plane down and to replace a lens because the shutter is stuck. That becomes very annoying, very financially problematic, and so on and so forth. So we're using the same technology now, because in cultural heritage we don't need to shoot at 1/2000th of a second. We can actually slow things down, which means that thing can actually last even longer. Now, add to that the fact that the sensor has its own on-sensor electronic shutter, and in many cases, especially when you use continuous lighting, if you don't need flash or anything, then you use the electronic shutter. That means that you can just use it forever and ever and ever. There's no wear or tear. There's nothing moving inside the camera or the lens. You might end up hearing the shutter clicking every now and again because the camera decides that it needs to do some dark calibration or something like that, but that's about it. Okay, that just shows you what we did with the 10G. Now 10G and Ethernet in general is something that keeps evolving. So instead of having the sockets and things like that buried inside the camera and soldered in, we said, let's just have a universal kind of connector inside the camera behind a little cover. You remove the cover and then you can pick any of the supported, let's say, 10G plugs that sits inside that socket, and then you just connect your RJ45 cable into that. So that just gives you an idea. And setting it up is like any kind of networking setup. So you create an IP address, and the camera will show you what the IP address is, and you decide who controls what, and so on and so forth. And that's all done from Capture One. So there's no need to, of course, you do need to understand IT a little bit, but if not, then somebody can help you do that. Then we thought, what else can we bring in? And I think timing-wise, it was almost a perfect situation, because DT, we knew they were working on the new smart controller for the photon lights. And I think it was Doug, actually, that we had that discussion, and Doug said, how about we make this new camera work with the new controller? And we thought, you know what, it's not a bad idea. Not at all. Maybe we put a little bit of effort in it and make the camera work with any kind of controllable lighting system. Albeit that at the moment, the smart controller from DT is the only one available, but the camera, it's an open, let's say, platform. It might require a little bit of coding or things like that, but if at any point somebody develops another system, or DT decide to upgrade the system or design something new, it's open. Now, what it actually allows you to do is control, let's say, the timing of when the light actually comes on, when the light comes off, pre-triggering, and so on. So imagine using LED lights instead of flash, but not having the LED lights on the whole time. So in terms of eye fatigue for the operators and things like that, that gives you much more flexibility, and you basically control everything from Capture One. Of course, you have the knobs and everything on the controller, but for the camera to pre-trigger the lights and then to let's say turn it on and turn it off, that is something the camera does. And we needed basically we were using the same connectors. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but we're using the same sockets on the back of the camera. It just meant that to be able to sync with the flash, we just move the flash sync socket to the side. That actually works really well. Now, if I'll just go back quickly to this one. Yeah, I don't know if you can see here that the LEDs are now actually at the top, or in many ways we call it the front of the body. So they don't need to be at the back where it's difficult to see what's going on because you have to climb up on a ladder or something. It just in your face, and in the, let's say, user manual, it actually tells you what each of these lights tell you. So whether it's the live view that is running, whether it's a camera that's busy saving something, or maybe there's an error of some sort. That's it. Moving on. Right, sensor. I don't think I have to say much other than maybe giving you a little bit of the BSI spiel. Maybe you heard about it because the IQ4 came out a while ago, and it's the same sensor, but it's all to do with where the electronics are set, where the micro lenses are set, and so on, and where the actual RGB filters are set. And that increased, and the way it's designed, it increases the sensitivity, it increases its ability to be used at, let's say, more acute angles, maybe less relevant for our applications, more relevant for architecture, for instance, when people use wide-angle lenses. In terms of ISO, it's the same as the IQ. Note that the achromatic, because it doesn't have those RGB filters in front of the pixels, is actually 2 stops more flexible, more, let's say, sensitive. That brings us to the lens, and I told you about, we need a really good lens so that we can actually capture all those larger objects and so on and so forth. What does that mean? That means that somebody needs to redesign or design a new set of optics from scratch. That's exactly what we did. It took a while. It wasn't easy. It's a very, I would say, complicated piece of electronics and glass and everything that connects them. There is a floating element inside. Now it's a motorized floating element that works in full sync with the focusing mechanism of the camera body. And we decided, okay, we need to find a new definition for this thing, and we called it ultra-res. And the whole thing is allowing you to cover a fairly large range of magnifications, and this thing goes down to about 1 to 3 without needing any kind of extension tubes. So you go from, let's say, 1 to 70, which in our terms, when it comes to cultural heritage, we're talking about 5.5 meters, so it's pretty much any kind of object. All the way down to 1 to 3, which is about, I would say, 4x5. If you're looking at, let's say, glass plate negatives or film, something like that, maybe a little bit bigger than 4x5. Yeah, and the maximum resolution that you can get with it on the iXH is just over 2000 ppi. Now, there's no telling without showing. And that's it. Actually, it's I see this as a cool story. This one. So, beginning of March, just before lockdown actually kicks in, when airports started getting a little bit empty and so on, I found myself visiting a customer with a prototype iXH. Customer in the south of the Netherlands, one of the larger service bureaus in Europe, actually. They're called GMS. And they were looking for a high resolution camera for a while. They've been using leaf backs and phase one backs and whatnots and Nikons and all sorts of things. But they also have some large format scanners that are old and that are dying and that are becoming difficult to maintain. So they invited us to come and do the test. And of course, I've known them for years, so we jumped on the opportunity, and why not? I mean, it's a good reference and it's a good real test. So the image that you see on the right, some of you might be familiar with the image engineering targets. This one is A0 plus size. So normally you would get them at A4 or A3, I think, but this is almost like 8 of those A3 stitched together, or they're actually printed together.
Interrupt you here, but you only have about 5 or so minutes left.
5 minutes? Yeah. Okay. All right. So just so you know, to be able to capture this properly, you need to spend a little bit of time and a little bit of effort on getting everything nice and straight. So whether you're using for example, the DT Titan copy stand, which can do A0, or you build your own bench or whatever, it needs to be something that can hold the camera steady, of course, and that allows you to align things up nicely. I won't bore you with that because there are quite a few techniques for it, but once you sort of get your head around it and you nail it, you might need a bit of a tweak every now and then because you realize that something's slightly off, but that's it. So just to give you some examples, this is the image here is not A0, it's more like A1, but it's just a random collection of objects. So when you think about it, you see this strip of 35mm film. So we're looking at around 400 ppi, and this is the kind of resolution and detail you end up seeing. And that's a piece of film. If I remember, it was at 200 ISO because I actually shot that piece of film. So I think it's 200 ISO. So it's kind of grainy, but you get the idea of the detail. Then we move on to another example, and this is around, I would say with the frame, it's around A4 size, something like that. And again, you get something like 1200, 1250 ppi. And this is the kind of detail that you get. And this is a handmade print, like a copper print or brass or one of those. So you can imagine what sort of detail is on there. So 1200 ppi becomes really, really useful for slightly larger objects now. Then it comes to the more, let's say, geeky side of things. So as an example, we are looking at, I think this one is again around 1200 ppi. And again, you can see what we're seeing in the corner. The whole thing about the lens is maintaining flatness and sharpness across the frame. So you get the basically the same resolution in the center as you get in the corners. Giving you another example, this was done at 2000 ppi, so it's nearly the limit of the lens, and this is actually comparing the existing or the current Schneider lens to the new lens. And when you look at these, they look pretty much the same. Now we start looking at the center. That's still very good. On the left-hand side, that's the Schneider, still excellent. Now we start looking at, let's say, the top left corner, and I think you can start seeing some differences. We have more examples. So this is another corner. And again, there is a difference there. And of course, the best thing for you is to test it yourself. So through DT, you can get some help and either borrow or rent or demo or remote demo or whatever the situation is currently. And we always say, just test it and see what you think. That's another example, and that's actually with a 120 millimeter lens, just to see what we can do for smaller objects. So we're looking at 4000 ppi, and we are looking at the corner of the frame, the edge of the frame. So again, this is using really, really small pixels with a very high resolution lens and imaging a fairly small objects. This is all spec stuff. So ISO I've given you. It lists everything you need to know in terms of resolution, of course, and what kind of connectivity you have there, and so on and so forth. This is all about the lens. Now, this all exists on DT's website, so if you need to sit and, with a cup of tea or coffee and have a read through it, that's all available. You might have some questions, so I can skip this one, so just we don't run out of time. Maybe 1 minute about what we've been doing in the last few months with this whole lockdown thing. And of course, as a research, development, and manufacturing company, we had to very, very quickly adjust ourselves to how do we do development, how we do manufacturing in different countries with different lockdown restrictions and rules and things like that. So we sort of employed all sorts of remote working things. And it's funny, but you can be in the office in Denmark and you walk by somebody's desk, they're at home, but you see a camera on the stand clicking away because they are programming it from their living room, things like that. But we also started looking at doing more things online, having more webinars available, doing more workshops, remote demos, figuring out with our partners how can we help customers that cannot travel, or we know that we cannot travel. How do we let people see and feel and gauge the, let's say, the capabilities and qualities of the equipment? What's coming? A lot of stuff in the works. We're working on software, we're working on hardware. New sensors is the obvious question, but that's not necessarily up to us. That's sometimes up to the vendors. And we know that for cultural heritage, when there is a bigger and better and high resolution sensor, we're likely to be the first ones to adopt it, but it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. Multi-spectral imaging is something that we've been investing a lot of time and effort into in the last, I would say, 2 years or so. We have separate webinars covering this area in terms of the technology and the theory and the physics behind it. So that's something we are happy to share. 3D imaging or 3D scanning or whatever people like to call it, that's again something that we've been working on. There's a research institute in Germany called Fraunhofer, probably one of the biggest in the world, and they are developing a system that is using our cameras, but they employ robotic arms and a very advanced piece of software that puts everything together and makes everything work automatically. So yeah, I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I think Doug will try to moderate them. You might be muted, Doug.
Thank you very much for presenting today and staying up late past your normal work hours. I greatly appreciate that. Before questions pop out, I'm going to toss one out first, just because, I don't know, it's been on my mind while I've been listening to the slide. First one is this MkII lens, is it beyond 3.6 micron resolving power?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we obviously spend so much time, effort, and money, obviously, on the design of it, that we looked at what's coming, not around the corner, but maybe around the next corner, to make sure that we have something that can cover everything. And especially when it comes to cultural heritage, it's the size of the pixels, but it's also the flatness of the frame, or the flatness of the field, because it's nice to have the highest resolution in the center. If your corners are not as sharp or not as good, then you might as well just it just shoots a smaller object. There's no point.
I like
in
to
that.
say it does not matter if the air is in focus. It matters only if the subject is in focus.
I like that, Doug. From sketching this out on a napkin to actually building an optical model to production, how long did that all take?
I would say to have the first sort of physical model that we can really put on a camera or in front of the sensor and test, you're looking at I would say 18 months, and that's with us doing all the work. So we're doing everything in-house.
You mean you do all that with math?
So we're using our Japanese engineers and manufacturing and everything to do the whole thing. And obviously it requires the integration and software integration and software profiling and things like that. So it's quite a complex project, especially when it involves that floating element.
I can imagine.
As part of
Yeah, I do have to say the results I've seen in that piece of glass is just stellar. Best thing I've seen on the market.
Yep.
All right, I'll be quiet and let's see who's gonna jump in for some questions. I'm gonna read the first one. Or Doug, is this something that you want to do?
Yeah, I'll take. You can read the question, but I'll take this one.
Okay. Are these advantages? I'm sorry. Are there a disadvantage to using a flat field lens for dimensional tabletop object photography?
So very quickly, we'll define flat field. It means the plane of focus is parallel to the sensor. That is generally mostly true of most lenses, but it is also generally slightly untrue of most lenses. Most lenses have a slight bowl shape to their focus plane. So especially towards the edge of the frame, the focus comes up a little bit towards the camera traditionally into somewhat of a flattened out bowl shape. Using a flat field lens is obviously very, very important when your subject is flat and when you want to use an aperture like f8 or f7 or f6 that are especially sharp but also have smaller depth of field. If you're applying that to something that is three-dimensional, it won't have any downside effects. It won't really, to be honest, have that much upside of using a flat field versus non-flat field. But these are also, to some extent, marketing terms and characterizations of a more complex scenario, and that is that lenses have many, many design attributes. And while it is true that this lens is flat field, and it's true that most are not, and that is a very powerful and good thing, there's a whole lot of things about this lens that are really, really good. So for example, the fact that it has extremely, extremely low chromatic aberration would be very important in three-dimensional photography, where the out of focus area may include some spectral highlights or some high contrast edges. So if you're shooting a vase with intricate black on white mazing patterns, for example, the well-corrected nature of this lens would be exceptional for that.
So I got a question for you, Yair. This particular lens, the MkII, does Phase One have any plans for this lens for use in the industrial market sector? Or did you see this more as purely a cultural heritage type optical solution?
We came into the project knowing that we want to create the best lens for cultural heritage applications. Bear in mind that there could be some other applications who basically require the same sort of behavior. Right? So when we say something like LCD panels, okay, and these days you get panels that are 100-inch diagonal or something like that, and they're like 12K or 14K and so on, then if you're doing any inspections of these panels and you want to see those little pixels in them and see if they are damaged or if the electronics are okay and so on, you need something flat. There are some industrial lenses, but those industrial lenses are usually designed to work at a very specific distance range, maybe a very specific aperture with very little flexibility, and in many cases, they don't necessarily allow you to integrate a shutter into them. So they're basically a very high quality piece of glass that you just screw in front of a sensor with a fixed focus distance, and that's about it. So they do a fantastic job, but they are not.
So it is
flexible.
it is the floating element in this lens that allows it to cover that
makes it
range
so
of magnification.
flexible. Yeah.
Where most lenses are either only pretty good at a lot of range or exceptionally good at one range. This can be exceptionally good at a variety of ranges, specifically because of the floating element design. That's what a floating element is used for.
If you try to think about other lenses that are fairly good at the wide range, if you look at for instance, the Schneider Blu-ring 120 macro, which also has a floating element, albeit a much less advanced in terms of how it moves inside and so on. It's just a helical movement. But again, this lens is very good from macro all the way to infinity. So we kind of looked at that because we make it in the same place. We looked at that and we thought about, well, what concepts can we sort of share between the two? I don't think there's anything that's shared between the two, but the idea of having a floating element that allows you that flexibility. And when you think about not needing to add extension tubes, not needing to power anything down or pull cables out or move the camera and rattle the copy stand or things like that, that's a big bonus, especially when you're looking at, let's say, higher volume digitization.
I think this actually dovetails nicely into the next question I'd like to flag, which is from Scott asking, is the new 72mm lens suitable for architectural photography? And I think it's actually a real big advantage of this equipment that it's actually pretty unsuitable for architectural photography, primarily for two reasons. One is that it is designed specifically and exclusively for the iX platform. And it's designed that way because that allows them to do this sophisticated floating element that is more sophisticated than you could move with your hand manually if they made it a manual adjustment. So that's one reason. The second reason is it is, of course, a relatively normal focal length. In most cases in architecture, you're looking at slightly wide to very wide. But it is precisely because Phase One did not try to make a lens that is suitable to sports and portrait and cultural heritage and architectural design that allows it to be so very, very good at shooting flat things pointing down, which is its first, second, and third use case.
Yeah, now of course you could say, well, what about large paintings? In a way, this is like shooting interiors, so it's kind of architecture. It's not really the case. It can do anything for those, 5.5 meters. So if it's a really flat wall with a very unique type of, I don't know, stucco on it or something that somebody needs to digitize.
You think about like a Diego Rivera mural, for instance?
Murals or frescoes. It can be art pieces, but give you an example, airplanes, and I know airlines and everything, the whole aerial industry is now, or let's say the airline industry is now in a bit of a trouble. But when you think about companies like Airbus or Boeing, right? Airbus, for example, they build those massive planes across Europe. So they have engines coming from one country, body parts coming from another one, being shipped on trucks and so on, and somebody assembles them. Sometimes some of these body panels need to go through refurbishment and repainting, and they paint them in one country, but they need to match the same kind of paint of the aircraft that is currently sitting in another country, right? And it's just that getting the right kind of tone, it's also getting the right kind of texture of the paint and so on and so forth. As far as we know, beyond using any sort of very advanced laser measuring devices and so on, the iXH and in many ways the iXG as well are the only cameras that can actually focus or autofocus accurately on these large flat objects, because they have the high resolution of the sensor, the high resolution of the lens, the flatness of the lens as well. And because we're using live view to do the focusing, we're not using a separate sensor that is less sensitive or less or has less resolution and so on. So we are actually focusing on the real image. if that makes
So,
sense.
as you all know, at this point, we're running over for about 5 minutes, and I'd like to leave time for one more question before we go to our breakout sessions.
So before I answer this question, I will point out, of course, that Yair and I will be in the breakout session and available for further questions. And of course, DT is always glad to talk to you about any of this technology, to arrange raw files, arrange testing, arrange evaluations, or whatnot. But the question from Pete is, considering the iXG and iXH both have functionality to integrate auto column, autofocus, and auto PPI, will either be able to accommodate the focus stack tool that's available with the XF camera system? So before, and I'll give Yair a minute to collect himself on what he wishes to promise or not promise, I will point out that at DT, we do have, thanks to our knob in our R&D team and our tech team, we do have a script that will allow you to do focus stacking using an iXG or iXH camera, or with an auto column, or a combination of both. That is not providing the functionality that the XF focus stack tool does, which is both to make the change in focus, but also to embed it in the metadata and to control the number of steps automatically. But the routine or automation of move and focus and shoot, move, focus, shoot, move, focus, shoot is possible today with a script from us, and that is a complementary script that our knob can provide to you. So you can just email us and we can provide that to you for an iXG or iXH. But yeah, you're to the question of, will phase one integrate a more formalized tool that would provide the metadata and the incremental control automatically? What would you say to that?
Okay, so right now, I'll give it as an example. If we look at our multi-spectral imaging solution, we actually do focus stacking there, irrelevant to the copy stand, albeit that the copy stand might come into that at some point. Right now with multispectral imaging, when you use different wavelengths, your focus plane changes as well. And what we're doing with the multispectral imaging system is that we actually allow the camera, you do some sort of pre-calibration, and then when you shoot, let's say, a stack of images, every image is perfectly focused, meaning that the lens or the camera actually need to move between images. And then we use our software to realign those images so they all come to the same size and shape and whatnot. So we already have a grab of what needs to be done.
So I have Yair as frozen on my screen. I think
Myself too. I think he's frozen.
His answer in short was that they have developed that in their multi-spectral platform, which is a breakout of their generalized platform. So it is possible for them to do that. Whether or not they will, I guess is, oh, Yair's back. So will you port that functionality to standard visible imaging?
So, we certainly have it fairly high up in our, let's say, feature request lists. And it requires some work in firmware and software, in Capture One, in whatever. And so I can't say, yeah, we'll have it, next month or next year or next release. But it's certainly something that we would like to do, whenever it's possible. Because we realize that when you shoot a book and you start moving pages and you have curving pages and you need to extend the depth of field or things like that, you need that extra flexibility.
All right. So thank you, Yair.